Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, societal collapse and how to avoid it. Every era has its moment of crisis, where it feels like the world is going to come to a screeching halt. The 20th century saw world wars, followed by the constant specter of nuclear Armageddon. At the turn of the millennium, it was the Y2K bug that led to doomers getting lots of airtime. And for me, growing up in India, there was no escape from Bollywood movies that reminded us all that we were living in what Hindus call the Kali Yuga, the era of darkness, the final stage where God will destroy evil and kickstart the era of renewal. The 21st century comes with its own threats. Not only the one this podcast focuses most on, climate change, but also pandemics. And most recently, the idea that an AI gone rogue will think humans are no longer useful and turn us all into paperclips. Jokes aside, for many, the fear of imminent societal collapse has grown with the realization that the global politics is no longer the same. As Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney put it recently, a rupture has taken place. Collapse is not a cheery subject, but it turns out it's also something that happens frequently, and there's a lot we can learn from the past. That's why I wanted to speak to Luke Kemp, a researcher affiliated with the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. He's the author of a new book called Goliath's Curse: The History and Future of Societal Collapse. The book looks at 5,000 years of human history to track the rise and fall of different societies and what is born out of the ashes. I asked Luke to bust some popular myths about collapse, whether all societies are doomed to fail, and if not, if our current moment makes us uniquely vulnerable, or perhaps we are more resilient than we think. As always, send your feedback to zeropod@bloomberg.net. Welcome to Zero, Luke.
Thank you for having me, Akshat.
The idea of societal collapse is pretty popular, especially these days, I feel like. So it was great to read your book because you actually put the science behind collapse and bust a bunch of myths around what people have popular notions around collapse. Let's just start with the definition of collapse, which you base on this database that you have developed at the University of Cambridge called the Mortality of States Index, or Moros, which is the Greek god of doom.
Very fittingly, yes. I used the database in large part to see what was the average lifespan of a state. Has this changed over history? And additionally, what are the causes behind all the different case studies to identify the commonalities? The way I define collapse is as a contraction and fragmentation of different power structures. So when the economy collapses, we call it an economic bust or an economic collapse. When a state falls apart, we call it a state failure or a state collapse. And when the population falls apart, we call it a population bust or a population collapse. When all these different power structures fall apart and break down together, we can then think of it as a societal collapse. Not every state or civilization, if you will, throughout history has collapsed. But societal collapse is a real recurring phenomenon.
And the idea that most people have, at least in modern culture, about collapse, I think would come from Hollywood. You know, movies like Mad Max, The Day After Tomorrow, Contagion, pick any zombie movie. You say in the book that is not what collapse looks like.
Unfortunately, I think most people have their view of collapse shaped by, as you mentioned, either disaster flicks or bad philosophy. In particular, the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, who has this idea that as soon as we are in a state without rulers, without an overarching authority, we will turn on each other in a violent scramble for resources. That just simply isn't true. When you look at the evidence we have from what's called disaster risk management, so studies of how people behave during earthquakes, natural disasters of different sorts, tsunamis, terrorist attacks, people tend to respond pretty egalitarian, pretty good at self-organizing, and they tend to be just pretty kind. A good example of this is what's called boat lift. So in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, within minutes, the Coast Guard put out a call for people to help move and ferry people away from ground zero across the Hudson River. That day, over 500,000 people were moved. And this was just done by average people using things like small fishing vessels. And this makes sense. We wouldn't have survived the Ice Age. We would not be here today if we were constantly killing each other and we just fell into mass panic every time we had a disaster.
And your book is called Goliath's Curse. You make a separation between society, civilization, and Goliath. What do you mean?
When you go to write a book on collapse, the obvious question you have to ask is, what is collapsing? And most people would say civilization. I'm a stickler for definitions, and the problem I found is that there are no good definitions of civilization. The definitions range from things like a checklist of 10 factors, which was developed by an Australian archaeologist, Gordon Childe, who said it's things like the presence of writing or long-distance trade. Doesn't quite make sense. All hunter-gatherer groups have long-distance trade, and the Incan Empire, which stretched all the way from Chile to Argentina, didn't have writing. And sometimes the definition's just very prejudiced. For instance, civilization being an advanced culture. Instead, when you look at it empirically, when we talk about civilization, when we talk about the first big kingdoms and empires like Uruk in Mesopotamia or the first dynasty of Egypt, what unites them, quite clearly, are things like large-scale warfare, slavery, and human sacrifice. What we're really seeing here is a movement away from egalitarian arrangements towards dominance hierarchies, in which a small group or individual rules over everyone else through violence. And hence, in the book, I refer to Goliath rather than civilization, and a Goliath is essentially a collection of these dominance hierarchies. So Rome was not just the empire, it's also the distinction we have between slave and master, rich and poor, man and woman. And
Goliath comes from the biblical story of this giant warrior who is then brought down by a young shepherd named David. Is there a David in your story?
I'd like to think that David is us. It's most ordinary people who don't want to be dominated. And when I chose the term Goliath, it was quite intentional. Civilization, one of the problems is it's a term of propaganda. It comes from the Latin root civilitas, which has these connotations of moderation, restraint, virtue, wisdom. There's nothing particularly virtuous or wise about doing mass human sacrifice. Instead, when we look at these early dominance hierarchies, they're marked by scale, they're very big, they rely upon violence, and they're surprisingly fragile. And all of those, of course, apply to the biblical tale of Goliath.
So let's start with busting some myths then, because one of those myths is that, typically people think of collapse as a problem. There is horror. There will be, as the Thomas Hobbes view would be, people become without government, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But you say collapse isn't always a bad thing. If anything, more often, collapse can be good for people.
Collapse is a process that has costs and benefits, winners and losers. And frequently the biggest losers were elites, and they're the ones who tended to write the history books. And sometimes the biggest benefactors were most ordinary people. A couple of examples here. When people think of modern collapses, they'll think of something like the state failure in Somalia in 1991. The Bahrain regime falls apart, and yet a decade later, people's lives are actually better. Maternal mortality is down by 30%, infant mortality by 24%, and extreme poverty by 20%. In general, life got better because the Bahrain regime was incredibly predatory, and people were better off under more localized forms of government, even sometimes warlords. Interestingly, this seems to be true even when we look further back in history. People tend to think of the collapse of Rome as being a complete historical tragedy. And yet afterwards, people in the skeletal record seem to be taller, and they have less holes in their teeth and less holes in their bones. They have less dental cavities and bone trauma. In short, they were healthier. The natural response of some people here is, well, so many people died, there were more resources left over, and hence the average person profited. That isn't quite true. Even people outside the empire tended to be taller, hence the idea of this big muscle-bound Germanic barbarian. That's because the people living outside the empire just simply were bigger and stronger than in comparison to the average Roman counterpart. So in general, it wasn't always good to be living under empire, and sometimes stripping away empire was actually good for many people.
You go through the history of collapses and you identify what leads to this tipping point of a collapse to happen. Typically, it's inequality, it's dominance hierarchies that are essentially very violent, are very clearly defined by conspicuous consumption of the elite at the top. But when civilization starts off and the worst of these bits don't exist, good things happen in a group of people organized in a society, right?
I think in general, when you get large groups of people together with a shared purpose, we can do very cool things. But this doesn't always require having a ruler, a king, or a set of elites. In the book, I go for a whole bunch of examples where you see early cities, you see examples of large-scale irrigation, large-scale farming, monuments, and all of these are done in what appears to be an egalitarian setting. And some of these include Tiwanaku, one of the very first cities in South America, Jene, one of the largest and earliest cities in East Africa, as well as one of the most fascinating case studies of the Harappan civilization, which was concurrent with Uruk roughly 2500 BCE in modern-day Pakistan. They had plumbing. They had very large bathhouses. They had very large shared cities, the largest of which may have held up to 40,000 people. But as far as we can see, there's no signs of rulers or elites. This was done just by people self-organizing.
But that's the exception, not the norm.
That is true. But the difficulty here is telling whether or not we require this on average, or whether or not the reason it's the exception is because, generally speaking, once you get large groups of people together with resources that can be easily seen, stolen, and stored, what I call lootable resources, eventually a set of elites or rulers almost always rise up and essentially take the credit. That's what we see in Tiwanaku. Early archaeologists felt that Tiwanaku was a typical example of you had a king and they helped to organize all this cool stuff, including the monuments, the irrigation canals. But the closer we looked, it seems like that wasn't the case. The elites came later, and actually the first signs of destabilization and collapse come after the elites rise up and inequality starts to rise alongside them.
There are two other authors who've popularized this idea. So one is Steven Pinker, who has talked about how we have become more and more peaceful species because violence has been falling. And you say that he's actually misreading the data.
Yes, absolutely. Steven Pinker has popularized the idea that the Paleolithic, so approximately 300,000 years ago through to roughly 11,000 years ago, once you have an entry into the warmer conditions of the Holocene, that during this period we were incredibly bloodthirsty. That on average, for every 100 people born, 15 were dying at the hands of another human, what we call a lethal violence rate of 15%. And others have said even higher, 25%. The problem is...
And that's fallen, and now we are at one in 100.
Exactly. It's gotten better and better over time, and today we're sitting at roughly, on a global level, 1.3% or so. If you count people taking their own lives, I think it ends up being over 2%. There's a few problems here. One is that Pinker relies upon a set of archaeological sites, and several of these are duplicates, and only one of them actually dates back to the Paleolithic, which seems kind of strange. That site is called Jebel Sahaba, and it's well known amongst archaeologists because it's incredibly exceptional. It's roughly 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, during a period of immense environmental upheaval when the entire climate of the Earth was changing. And we have roughly just over 50 skeletons which have signs of violence, whether it be parry wounds, so someone blocking a blade with their forearm, or even projectiles embedded into the bones. A better study was done by two archaeologists at the Chicago Field Museum, Haas and Pastelli, and they looked over 4,000 skeletons and 300 sites. They found essentially only one site that was unequivocally a site of violence, and that was Jebel Sahaba. The best systematic studies we have all suggest that the rate of violence is probably closer to 1% to 2%. And that's also supported by genetic evidence too. And it's also supported by when we look at studies of battlefields, what's called killology. In short, people don't seem to want to kill each other. And there's plenty of both evidence from battlefield reenactments, interviews, etc., where people seem to often fire away from their enemies or above them. That would be very strange if we were evolved to be bloodthirsty killers.
And then the other author that you call out is Jared Diamond, who wrote a book called Collapse. Mm-hmm. And you think he also got certain things wrong.
Diamond both gets particular case studies wrong. So, for instance, the Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island, he attributes this as being a case of ecocide, that essentially they deforested their island so excessively that eventually the entire society fell apart due to a lack of food supply and fell into cannibalism and infighting. That just isn't supported by the evidence anymore. We can see that there wasn't a population collapse until Europeans arrived. This was a case of genocide, not ecocide. It was from imported diseases and the violence of invading Europeans. But apart from that, Diamond only looks at a small handful of case studies, 5 in particular, and 3 of those are islands. That's not exactly a good representative set of case studies that are analogous to the modern world. I think Diamond does some interesting work as well on top of that, but ultimately, it's not a systematic or really accurate view of how collapses unfolded across history.
Throughout history, we can also note that because of perhaps societies being created, civilizations being created, and them collapsing, we have seen overall progress happen, right? We live healthier, wealthier, longer lives today. But you argue that actually the things that have allowed that kind of progress are also the things that are increasing the risk of collapse. What do you mean?
Well, first of all, when you notice all these graphs which show things like life expectancy increasing, infant mortality decreasing, literacy rates increasing, progress happening, they must always pretty recent. They usually date back to the last century or two. In the book, I go through a couple of different indicators, both health, happiness, and income or standard of living, if you will. You can look at standard of living in terms of people's average real wage. You can look at health in terms of skeletal height, which is kind of a good overall proxy for human health. And what you see is that when people picked up farming, they become substantially shorter by a couple of inches. In short, it was a wrecking ball to their health. You'll see the emergence of most diseases we have had to deal with throughout history, like smallpox, influenza, etc. So that's not really a progress story. And interestingly, human height more or less plateaus from the uptake of agriculture in the first states all the way through to the Industrial Revolution. A similar story of real wages. There's actually no big increase in real wages all the way through to the Industrial Revolution. Everything increases thereafter, but doesn't actually happen with the Industrial Revolution. Here in the UK, people actually get shorter during the Industrial Revolution. Life expectancy drops. It isn't until you have big social movements, suffragettes, unionists, and others, all demanding things like sanitation, a 40-hour working week, and of course, the vote. It's the combination of both technological change and social struggle that leads to progress. And that's a very different story to this overall idea of empire, states, and just simply time make progress. That's not true. Progress needs to be fought for.
After the break, I ask Luke what we can learn from the collapse of past Goliaths to help us create stronger, more equal societies. And while I've got you, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. It helps new listeners find the show. So if you draw lessons based on what you see in history, in societal collapse, there is the rise of essentially the darker impulses of human nature, which is dominance hierarchies typically powered by increase in wealth inequality, wanting status, using arms race to try and get even more land or even more resources, taking lootable resources, as you call, things that you can store and trade like gold or wheat or rice. Are there other ingredients that are necessary for societal collapse to happen, or are things that would increase the probability of societal collapse?
When we talk about risk, we talk about 4 different factors: the hazard, the vulnerability, the exposure, and response. So for instance, a tsunami be the hazard, but your vulnerability is the fact that you don't have infrastructure to withstand it. Your exposure, you lie in the path of the tsunami, and your response, how you respond can make things better or worse. And these will apply to collapses as well. My key argument is that Goliath's curse is the simple idea that Goliaths contain the seeds of their own demise. And this is for the reason that wealth inequality tends to increase over time this leads to excessive gross levels of inequality. So, for instance, one study of 28 pre-modern states found that, on average, there was 77% towards the theoretical maximum level of inequality. That maximum level is a situation in which one individual owns all the surplus wealth and everyone else has just enough to survive and reproduce on. In short, we were 3/4 towards that across most pre-modern states. That has a whole bunch of knock-on effects. As you become more unequal, you tend to become more polarized. There tends to be an increase in elite competition, battling for a small number of thrones. People tend to become more immiserated as the cost of living increases, what we would call today a cost of living crisis, and a whole bunch of other different effects, including increased socio-political violence, for instance. I go through all these and show that these basically increase vulnerability, but you still often need a shock. And often that shock came in the form of either disease, invaders, or, quite frequently, climate change.
If we take that 5,000-year history and we look at modern society, you make a clear differentiation that today something is fundamentally different from those societies. So before we talk about the differences, what are lessons from the old collapses that we can pull into today's world?
I think a fairly simple one is that inequality is corrosive and dangerous. And we see that today as well. When we look across the OECD, whether it's the UK, the US, or Australia, you see quite clearly similar trends. It's not just rising wealth inequality, it's also democratic backsliding, increasing polarization, the rise of the far right. All of these have pretty clear empirical relationships to inequality, even things like corruption. And that is clearly making these states more destabilized and heading down a much darker path. So I do think that the central thesis here that inequality tends to be corrosive to society still holds true to today. But the other slight difference here, but it still relates back to inequality, is that the biggest threats we face today would be climate change, advanced AI systems, engineered pandemics, or even things like nuclear weapons. They all still rely upon global inequality and systems of exploitation. So in the book, I point out that if you're going to build a lethal autonomous drone, a killer robot, if you will, or you're going to build a nuclear weapon, you essentially rely upon very cheap materials and minerals from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. So for instance, building a large language model or a drone requires cobalt. 70% of the world's cobalt supply comes from the DRC. Roughly half of that is dug up by artisanal miners who work in some of the most exploitative, slave-like conditions possible, working for a couple of dollars a day. And the same holds true for the very first sources of uranium used for nuclear weapons, which were dug up, once again, the DRC, under the supervision of the Belgian authorities, who are known for being some of the most ruthless colonizers possible. Wherever you look, inequality lurks beneath the biggest challenges we face.
But there is a big difference compared to previous civilization, which is ours now is perhaps the biggest of the Goliaths that has existed because we are fully globalized, fully interconnected. Supply chains are making us interdependent. And to that, you're adding these technological layers that did not exist for previous civilizations of nuclear war, of AI, of climate change, to the extent and the pace at which we are causing it, because climate change has happened in the past, but the pace at which we are doing it with fossil fuels is unprecedented. And so if there are these lessons on inequality and on resource extraction, it still makes us, in a way, much more vulnerable and at a risk of a much worse collapse than we have ever seen in the past, right?
Absolutely.
Previous collapses turned out to be good things for some people at some points. Now, there doesn't seem like a good scenario if collapse happens.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are two things that are different today, and neither of them are good. The first is, as you've alluded to, the threats we face are far bigger and worse. Climate change in the past that helped topple societies, it was usually cooling of roughly 1 degree Celsius at a regional level. Today, we're facing global climate change of roughly somewhere between 3 or more degrees Celsius. These are much, much worse threats. The second is that collapse, as you mentioned, is likely to be far worse. I like to say that collapse has a bright history but a dark future. And this is for a few reasons. One is, as mentioned, the scale of the threats we face. A second is we rely much more upon global industrialized supply chains than ever before. Previously, people could quite easily move back to farming or doing more hunting and gathering. Most people cannot do that any longer. The third is that we now live in a global Goliath. We live in one integrated economic and political system. The fourth is that states historically weren't very good for their citizens. They didn't provide many public goods. But today, if you're living in Denmark, it's actually quite a bad thing if Denmark falls apart. And last but not least is one of the bad things that often happens during collapse is there is a glut of violence as small groups of armed young men try to recreate a state or an empire. Previously, that was done with handheld bronze and iron axes and swords or muskets. Today we have nuclear weapons and killer robots. And all those together mean that unfortunately collapse in the future is more likely to be pervasive, large scale, and much, much worse.
So let's talk about some of the ways in which we can try and essentially avoid this collapse, because this time around, we cannot afford a collapse. And your book, despite the cheery subject of collapse, actually ends on an optimistic note because there are ways out of this situation. What would that look like?
It's worth noting that when it comes to addressing most of these individual threats, whether it be nuclear weapons or climate change, there are no large-scale technical impediments. We know we can reduce nuclear stockpiles. The US was dismantling more than 1,000 weapons per year during the 1990s. Every single major economy has a detailed plan of how they can reach net zero emissions by 2050. The problem is not technical, it's political. What we need to do, I believe, is try to level the different sources of power. We don't just need to have economic equality, but we also need to have equality in terms of political voice, in terms of our access to information, and potentially even in terms of overseeing violent means like the military. If I was going to choose one big intervention, what I put forward in the book is the implementation of what's called open democracy or deliberative democracy, where rather than relying upon voting, you rely upon sortition, randomly selecting average people, bring them together in a group, they're briefed by experts, and then they come to a conclusion. And if I can provide one example here, it's a thought experiment called the Trinity Jury. In 1945, we had what was called the Trinity Test, which was the detonation of the world's very first atomic weapon in the sands of New Mexico. Prior to that test, the night beforehand, the physicist Enrico Fermi had been taking bets as to whether or not that test would destroy the entire world. That's because his colleague, Edward Teller, had made a calculation that there was a non-zero chance that detonating the bomb would ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth, thus killing not just every single human, but every single shred of life on this planet. By that time, the US also knew the Nazis were no longer capable of building their own atomic weapon. So this wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. In the book, I put forward a pretty simple experiment. Imagine that you had a citizens' jury, that you randomly selected nurses, teachers, farmers from across the US, you put them in a room, you gave them that information, and you asked them, should we detonate that weapon? The reaction I have from most people is disbelief. Of course not. And I think this holds true for many things. If we had a citizens' jury sitting in on ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies during the 1970s when they had information about climate change and they intentionally buried it and ran misinformation campaigns financed by tens of millions of dollars, I'm pretty certain those citizens' juries would not have said, yes, please lie to my friends and family.
I've been to a citizens' jury that was done in the UK. Let me come back to that. But before we do, there is an aspect of this that we also must acknowledge. So many scientists have been involved in making atomic bombs and then hydrogen bombs or thermonuclear bombs. One of them was asked, do you regret having contributed to what is an existential threat for humanity? And his answer was pretty interesting. He said, I wish it were not scientifically possible to make the weapon.
Right.
The implication being the fact that we can make it. If I wouldn't have made it, somebody at some point would make it. And so we do live in this competitive world. You talk about how competition between dominance hierarchies leads to collapse. when there are big wars. Sometimes that can be good, but that competitive nature, which is also there in humans, has allowed for some progress, but also leads us to these problems. So how do you actually work around the competitive pressures? How do you, if you want to create a citizens' jury at the global level or even in every country, how are you going to remove the competitive layer that holds this back?
Yeah, so this is a very common refrain you hear from, say, for instance, tech executives like Sam Altman is, if it can be built, it will be built. Hence, we're not really bad guys. We kind of have to build it, unfortunately. It's interesting because this is often built upon what's called game theory, which is essentially the mathematical exploration of how people act in cooperative environments when they're self-interested actors. What's funny is when you put regular humans into these experiments, they don't tend to end up in arms races or races for resources like this. They actually tend to be very worried about things like status, fairness, stuff like that. There's two exceptions to this. One is people who are trained in economics and finance, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of everyone else is going to act like an asshole, so I have to do. And the second is people who are high in the dark triad. The dark triad is a set of 3 antisocial personality traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. In the book, I put forward the case that our institutions over-select for people who are high in these traits, and that's just simply empirically true. Amongst men, at a population level, roughly 1 in 100 people would pass the clinical threshold for psychopathy. In boardrooms and parliaments, it's roughly 3 to 21%. There's dispute over the numbers, but there's no dispute over the fact that they are overrepresented in positions of power. And when you look at our corporations as states, they kind of look like psychopaths. So it's unsurprising they end up in these big races for new weapons, new resources, etc. So what we need to do is actually redesign our institutions from the bottom up in a way that doesn't select for the worst of us, but actually makes use of our very best characteristics, our ability to cooperate, to deliberate, to change our minds. And that's where I think having more democracy is potentially a really big avenue for essentially saving the world and finding a way out of arms races.
So citizens' juries have been applied specifically to climate. So the one I attended here in the UK was in 2020. And it was a really good experience, exactly as you defined, which is you had this random but representative set of people who were informed by experts and then who were asked a series of questions around climate policy. And those results were then put in a report to inform the government, and it went nowhere. There have been citizens' juries in other places which have been more effective. There was one in Ireland looking at abortion, and that did have societal benefits that came as a result of that. But they are, again, it's exceptional, not the norm. Direct democracy exists in some places like Switzerland, where you have referendums on key issues. Estonia, where you have much more voting directly done with the internet rather than the physical paper that we still use in many countries, because they've figured out a system that is trustworthy enough. It still leaves the question, if the institutions are filled with these people and they are pervasive and they are everywhere, and they are the people who are competing, not us average humans, how do you replace them with a system that is much more egalitarian, deliberative, like a citizens' jury?
Alas, I'm not a prophet. I'm not entirely sure, to be frank, and it's something I don't delve into in the book, that I don't have a complete blueprint as to how we get from here to this future where power is more balanced, where we're not trapped in arms races. That's a topic for another book. I do have some rough ideas here. For instance, I think populism, strangely enough, is actually one opportunity. Populism is a very weird, broad term and encapsulates a Bernie Sanders voter as well as a Trump voter. The one thing that unites them is they have this underlying idea that currently they're not properly represented in government, the average person needs to have more democratic representation, and the world's getting worse because of corrupt elites. And I don't think that's entirely untrue. And I think both a Trump supporter and a Sanders supporter would probably support the idea of having citizens' juries, whether it be in government or potentially for big tech as well. I think that this is a real political opportunity, particularly on the left right now, which is struggling, let's face it, across many different countries. And the other area here, which really gives me hope, is just simply technology. It's been very difficult historically to do democracy effectively at scale. But now we do have the technology to do so. And what's really promising is we don't even try right now. We probably spend at least less than 100th on improving democracy than what we spend on improving mass surveillance and facial recognition. Imagine if, rather than simply saying, we need to compete with countries because we're democracies and we have to win, we actually spent money on trying to improve our democracies. Imagine where we could get to. So I think if we just simply move research and funding towards actually supporting the values that we uphold as a society, and we start to tap into the popular discontent people have towards modern day electoral democracies, there's a lot of energy and a lot of technical solutions to have a very different, far better world.
In trying to build this more democratic society, we kind of did play an experiment out after the World Wars. The creation of the United Nations, as flawed as an institution it has been, you acknowledge in the book that that post-war period has been an exceptionally peaceful time, even by the history of the 5,000 years of the Moros database, right?
It's also been an exceptionally equal time, and in general, an exceptionally good time. When people talk about making America great again, at least for white men, they usually think about the 1950s and 60s. What happened during the 1940s and 50s is you had what's called the Great Compression, a combination of the world wars destroying a lot of old money, and additionally, large amounts of people being much more involved in a wartime economy, being armed, and demanding things like a vote and requiring progressive taxation actually to support the wartime effort. All of that created the perfect storm for a far more equal set of societies in places like the UK and the US. Lo and behold, things tended to get better. It's also worth noting that when we look back to classical Greece, we tend to uphold Athens, which had this democratic model, which was once again built on sortition and having citizens' juries and assemblies. It wasn't just having democracy and equality at a local level. As you mentioned, we did have better efforts to try to have global governance through things like the United Nations. It was deeply flawed and often it was overly representative simply of US interests. This particularly includes things like the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institutions. But nonetheless, it was an attempt to try to better coordinate and cooperate at a global level. And ultimately, we will need that in the long term. I'm not sure if it'll be through the UN, but you can imagine something like federated democracies, where basically you have citizens' juries and assemblies at a local level, they scale up to a national level, and then eventually into a global level as well. So trying to bypass having a world of competing individual empires and nation states.
And do you think the conversation at the geopolitical level right now, where Mark Carney has come out with this idea that it's a rupture, that these big powers, mainly the US and China, are making the world a more dangerous place, but the middle powers, as he calls them, which you probably can put a bunch of European countries, at least individually, if not the EU as a collective, together can try to build a world order, an international order that is clearly not working, is breaking down or is being broken down, could build this new order. Can you imagine a more democratic order coming as a result of the middle powers coming together?
Absolutely. My PhD thesis was on how do you have successful international agreements without the leadership of the United States? And one finding I had was that the most successful treaties we've had have actually tended to start in smaller groups and then expand over time. This is true of the Montreal Protocol, ozone-depleting substances, which started with only approximately 42 countries or so. It's also true to the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, the GATT, which preceded the WTO. In general, that tends to work quite well. A small group of countries can provide momentum. They can create new norms which spread across the world. And also, they can basically change technology, which again spills over in other countries. If you're happy about China taking more action on climate change, you can thank Denmark and Germany for lowering the cost of solar PV and wind. And hence, I do think these critical mass approaches can actually be really successful. The one area where I'd actually disagree with Carney, who, as you mentioned, gave this very historic speech at Davos, and I think the first half is correct in terms of identifying that we've lived under a beautiful lie for the last few decades. But then he goes into a weird kind of tangent of the way to get around this is by countries choosing coalitions that suit them, spending more money on defense, and in the case of Canada, having less capital gains tax. These are all things that Donald Trump both does and would support. You don't act like China and the US if you think China and the US are destroying the world. And similarly, if we want to defend democracy from Russia, don't act more like Russia. So I do think that these coalitions could work, but ultimately it requires a different approach, which once again is more about investing in democracy and trying to find ways past arms races rather than simply continuing business as usual.
But there's still the struggle that, there are places in the world which are promoting these democratic values that may, if given the opportunity, allow us to build a world that is more egalitarian. But you have rogue actors like Russia, or these days even the United States, who are very powerful, who have the biggest nuclear arsenal. And in the face of that threat, everybody else must find a way to defend themselves. How do you get out of that?
First of all, I'd like to paraphrase Marcus Aurelius. The best insult to give to an enemy is not to become like them. And secondly, I feel like we often overblow how under threat we currently are. So prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, most of the different simulation, war gaming, etc., all predicted that if Russia mobilized its military, it would wipe through Ukraine in less than a month and be on the doorstep of Europe within a few months, even a few weeks potentially. We've found actually Russia's ended up being a bit of a toothless tiger, to be frank. It has struggled to keep a small amount of land in Ukraine. Do we really think it's going to take over all of Western Europe? And the US, yes, it's a problem. But ultimately, are we going to change the US or even stand up to them by just becoming more like them and letting big tech, for instance, walk all over Europe and the UK? No, it's going to be by building our own infrastructure, which is built upon different values in comparison to what Silicon Valley has. Overall, once again, the best way forward is to become not like your enemies, but to forge a different path. And I do think we're lucky to be in a world where things are so interconnected that this is not often a really big advantage to having something like a global war.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Zero. Now for the sound of the week.
Line's fine.
Line's perfect.
Line's good, boys.
Yep.
That is the sound of the Great Britain team curling at the recently concluded Winter Olympics. The team lost the gold medal match to Canada. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Samar Sadi, Laura Milan, and Sharon Chen. I'm Akshat Rathi, back soon.